Is a US war with Venezuela inevitable? We all saw the dramatic seizure of an oil tanker. We've heard the pretext that Donald Trump et al. Have used, and which is focused on the question of drugs. Is that really what's going on here? Is regime change on the horizon from an administration which, let's not forget, promised to put an end to endless wars? What could the consequences be? Well, there's no better person to speak to than Miguel Salas, who is a Venezuelan historian, professor emeritus at Pomona College at Claremont, California, and also a residential fellow at the Quincy Institute, which very much focus on questions of, I guess, diplomacy and looking for peaceful resolutions in a world of terrible conflict. It's great to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I just want to start, actually, first of all, we'll talk about, what could actually happen next. What, in terms of what the pretext that's being talked about, and that's the question of drugs. And, obviously Donald Trump spoke a lot all the way through about having a porous border, drugs coming over, fentanyl, all the rest of it. What do you make of that whole pretext, I guess?
Well, the reality is that Venezuela is not a producer of drugs. There is no fentanyl exported from Venezuela. It does not have the apparatus. It does not have the precursor chemicals. Most fentanyl is produced in Mexico or in the U.S. Southwest. The reality is that even the American intelligence branches have all stated that there is no fentanyl and that less than 7% of the cocaine coming into the U.S. is trafficked through Venezuela, originating elsewhere in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and elsewhere. So that Venezuela is not a major player in the drug transactions occurring with the U.S. And the little drugs that do go through Venezuela are mostly destined for Europe, not for the U.S. So it's a pretext. It's a pretext that the administration has utilized to try to fuel its efforts in the Caribbean. And it's a pretext that the opposition has grabbed on to reconcile their position with the administration. They know the administration wants to hear about this. The same thing they're doing now. They're outsourcing their opposition to the U.S. government to effectively try to affect regime change in Venezuela. Now they're saying that it's Hezbollah in Venezuela. Now they're saying that it's Iran in Venezuela. Now they're saying that there are Russian agents in Venezuela, that the country has been invaded, that the U.S. must take action. Again, they're in a way, what they've done is they've reached the limits of their own capacity, and now they're hoping the U.S. can turn the tide for them.
We'll talk about, obviously, that question, because it's central, obviously, the question of regime change. Just in terms of the seizure of an oil tanker, is it just worth spelling out the significance of that? Look, the international so-called rules-based order, such as it existed, has gone up in smoke. But what do you make of the significance of that?
Well, it's an escalation. We've had since September. We've had the deployment of U.S. military forces in the Caribbean in ways we have not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, in that sense, it is a dramatic escalation, knowing full well that Venezuela is dependent on its oil exports in order to have resources with which to import basic items, medicines, food, other products. So that this could tilt the balance in terms of furthering the crisis that already exists in Venezuela with inflation, with recession. One economist, Francisco Rodriguez, estimates that on board the boat there was 78 million barrels of oil. $78 million in oil barrels, 5% of a monthly export out of Venezuela. So in that sense, it's a dramatic escalation. And if it continues, it would strangle the economy and it would lead the country into a deep recession.
Just with that context, because Donald Trump imposed severe sanctions on Venezuela in his first presidential term, what was the impact of that?
The impact was that it worsened an already existing economic crisis. It worsened it in such a way that over 8 million people left the country. So that if you looked at what caused that migration, it was mismanagement on the part of the government. It was corruption on the part of the government, but it was also sanctions. Sanctions kill. Sanctions have an impact. Sanctions are felt by the population, and the people who pay the price are the common folk. They're the ones who are leaving the country as a result of sanctions. If the idea that sanction was going to affect regime change, it would have done it in Iran. It would have done it in Cuba. It would have done it elsewhere where it's been applied, and it has never produced the outcome. But it has increased the suffering for the population.
I mean, so in terms of regime change, I mean, is that what are we talking? Do you think, in terms of the prospects of an act? I mean, because they've obviously settling on regime. I mean, well, I suppose spell it out. Do you think they are definitely now? Donald Trump has settled on regime change, and to do that via an armed conflict?
Well, he is starting in his first administration. He applied what he called maximum pressure. They recognized an interim president named Juan Guaido. It was 60 different countries recognized him. The reality is that after several years, Guaido was in Miami, Maduro was still in Caracas, and that policy failed. Now they've attempted to escalate that policy for regime change in the context of a military presence strangling Venezuela. I think it began as a black op operation to see if they could find any fissures within the Venezuelan military, any fractures within the Venezuelan political party. None have appeared. So they keep escalating and escalating and escalating. Short of an actual invasion, they don't have enough troops for an actual invasion. Some estimates indicate between 10 and 15,000 U.S. Marines or troops are in the Caribbean. That is not enough to take a country the size of Venezuela with 31 million inhabitants. So the reality is that they keep escalating it in terms of pressure, in terms of sanctions. And the latest one was the seizure of the skipper tanker that was occurred yesterday.
I mean, do you think there could be the prospects, for example, of an aerial bombardment, an aerial onslaught against Venezuela, such as the US has done repeatedly without invading a country, just bomb it?
We know that Trump has discussed it. We know that Mark Espers, his Secretary of Defense in the first administration, talked about Trump wanting to launch missiles into Mexico. We know that he's talked about launching missiles into Venezuela. And yesterday he said to Colombia, "You're next." So that he's been escalating the conflict in the context of his national security strategy that came out last week, where the U.S. Assumes the only right to interfere in the region and to prohibit any other country from, quote unquote, interfering economically, politically, or socially in the region. So yes, Trump has talked about it. The unfortunate reality, if that happens, is Venezuelans would die. It wouldn't just be targeted for the military. Most military installations are in civilian areas, so that the outcome of that would be what they would call collateral damage, which means civilians died in the process. And that would be the legacy of Donald Trump, and that would be the legacy he most is concerned about, because this person is all about status and position and symbolism. That's why when he talked about the tanker yesterday, he said the biggest tanker ever captured and seized. Again, it's all symbolic as part of his symbolic campaign against Venezuela.
I mean, what do you make of the purported demands that have been made by Donald Trump to Maduro, the president of Venezuela, in terms of? I mean, a lot of this is difficult to know, kind of the kind of propaganda, but it's kind of slightly gangsterish demands, basically, kind of like, flee the country, etc. And then, and again, what do we know is real or not? And it's about the idea of will they, get immunity, and the US not pursuing them, that kind of thing. What do you make about what do you make of the demands, and what do you think is real and not real?
Well, all we know for sure is that there was a conversation between Maduro and Trump. Each side then spins the narrative to suit their own agenda. So that Trump says, "I gave him a way out, him and his family, and would not have sanctions on him." The government of Maduro says that didn't happen. Again, we know that Trump wants Maduro out of the country. We know that his position is regime change, as it has been, interesting enough, for several American presidents, going back to Bush, going back to Obama, Trump's first administration, and now Trump's second administration. And part of the strategy is being promoted by Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, a son of Cuban exiles, who not only wants Venezuela in the crosshairs, but also wants Cuba, Nicaragua, and Mexico in the crosshairs, as well as including Colombia and Brazil. So what they want to do is establish U.S. hegemony. They want to have U.S. control of the region. They want to exercise that unilateral control in the region, and that's largely what they're trying to accomplish.
I mean, do you think what's happening here is a kind of US general retreat from the status of global hegemon, with in terms of the repositioning with Europe, what's going on as well with Russia, Ukraine, and with the idea of going instead to a great power kind of 19, kind of kind of 19th century, I guess, before the British Empire was completely dominant. That kind of great power where you sketch out spheres of influence, and it's a case of, well, going back to the Monroe doctrine, this is our sphere of influence. We'll retreat as a global hegemon, but instead we'll treat this back, our backyard, America's backyard, as it always called. That's now our sphere of influence, and will be a kind of 19th century great power who does that.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what the National Security Strategy document suggests. That suggests very clearly states, and we've seen it from Marco Rubio, we've seen it from Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. We've heard it from Trump. This is our backyard. We will decide who operates. We will decide who can invest, who can't invest. But that sphere of influence is very interesting, because if we try to apply that, that means Russia gets to have its sphere of influence. That means Ukraine. That means that China gets to have its sphere of influence. That means Taiwan. So again, if we go down that path, it will produce great superpowers. But again, each with their own sphere of influence, and each with a very problematic outcome.
I mean, just tell us a bit more about that national security strategy. Is it, kind of what to get a bit more context about what it is and what it sets out, other than that?
Well, it sets out for the Western Hemisphere, it sets out that the U.S. is the dominant power. It restates itself as now the Trump corollary to the Monroe doctrine. So now it elevates Trump to the level of the Monroe doctrine and the corollary. It doesn't mention the Roosevelt corollary, which actually gave the U.S. itself gave itself the power to intervene, to send troops, to maintain order. In fact, this document actually says the Latin Americans should rule their countries regularly, but the U.S. reserves the right to interfere, to intervene, reserves the right to exploit its resources, as we've seen from the national security documents in the past. But this one is much more explicit. This one is much more clear about it. Latin America is ours. We intend to exercise our influence, our power. And then it throws in Europe. That Europe isn't doing enough to maintain its culture, its identity. And it says that Europe must now have its civilization role reasserted, and that the U.S. is hoping to accomplish that as well. So it's a very multifaceted document that is egregious to many people throughout the continent, establishing the U.S. as the new imperial domain and the new dominant hegemon in the world.
I mean, do you think this is a kind of honest, I guess, restatement, I suppose, of, well, I'm trying to say how much continuity there is, basically, which is for the last few decades, the US obviously has been the global hegemon, but it's often shrouded itself in kind of liberal veneer discourse about human rights. And, look, speaking of Latin America, before I was born in the 1970s, my parents took in Chilean refugees who fled a country which the US had helped engineer a coup on the basis, as Henry Kissinger put it, we won't let a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people. And obviously intervened throughout Latin America, committing terrible, heinous, supporting military coups, supporting, right-wing militia, which committed terrible crimes. I mean, in a sense, is it kind of just a lot of continuity here, but there's just less pretense? They're just out in the open going, yeah, this is all about our self-interest. We don't actually care about anything else.
Well, I think there's a weakness there. The fact that you have to state it, the fact that you can't exercise it, the fact that you cannot accept it by default means that the U.S. is concerned. In the last 25 years, given the rise of the left governments in Latin America, the U.S. has lost a lot of its influence. The U.S. is no longer the dominant hegemon for South America. The number one trading partner is China. China is the number one trading partner for Chile, for Argentina, for many countries in the region. And what I would encourage your listeners to look at is the day the U.S. decides to launch its mission in the Caribbean, the Chinese were investing $1 billion in a refinery in Venezuela to produce light crude in Venezuela. So again, we have a context in which the U.S., it feels it's being displaced, is now compelled by its own desire to promote itself as the dominant hegemon, because in reality, it now confronted a multipolar world instead of the unipolar world that the U.S. would like it to exist.
Is this about oil? Venezuela's got the biggest oil reserves on the face of the earth. And, but part of, I guess you could say, a strategic retreat in some senses from the Middle East means a way of, gaining what they would regard as energy security, to just grab the oil supplies which are nearby in Venezuela.
Oil is a factor. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of oil in reserve, the largest in the world, as you pointed out, followed by Saudi Arabia. But it's also very heavy crude, high in sulfur, which means that its refining requires greater attention and requires being diluted with naphtha and with other elements, which are imported in part from Algeria, from the U.S., from other areas, so that the oil itself is a factor, but it requires greater refinement that only certain countries had, and that one of them was the U.S. in Houston, or the other one was the Chinese, the Indians. So in that sense, it places Venezuela at the crosshairs of countries that want oil, but at the same time, it means that that oil itself, it requires greater refinement and greater cost to produce. So in that sense, yes, it's about oil, but there's also contingent factors involved in that production.
I know the Trump administration is going on about Venezuela and Iran, and that's all kind of silly, really. But what about the role of, as you say, China and also Russia? I mean, they have, as you say, we've had this pink wave of progressive governments across Latin America, which sought to, I guess, achieve independence from US hegemony. Though there is obviously a far right surge in Latin America as it is everywhere. And obviously, we saw that with Brazil. Bolsonaro's gone, but still the Bolsonarismo lives on. There's Chile, where the far right, pretty good nick, unfortunately. Argentina, obviously in power, Milei, who was the favored son of Trump. What do you think? I mean, do you think what could China and Russia, in terms of Venezuela, regard this as kind of their sphere of influence and push back at a regime change?
China's role has been economic, largely buying oil. It's probably the largest purchaser of Venezuelan oil through a series of arrangements, debt swaps, etc. Russia's presence has been more symbolic, expressing solidarity with the Venezuelan government. They really don't have a foothold economically in the country to the same extent that China does. Venezuela is in debt to China for a significant amount of money. Much of the oil it exports is part of that debt swap. So I think in what the U.S. is concerned most about is the presence of just the mere presence of China. But China's presence is not just in Venezuela; it's in Peru, where they just inaugurated a large deep water port. It's in the Caribbean and elsewhere. It's in the Panama Canal. That's what concerns the U.S., and that's where the U.S. is no longer the dominant hegemon.
I mean, on that, I suppose, I mean, Brazil, which is one of the driving forces of BRICS, Russia, India, China, and so on. They're trying to create a kind of alternative power block, I guess. What do you think of the role of that? Brazil there being, under Lula, of course, President Lula, very much part of that pink wave, one of the pioneers of the pink wave, came back to power after being imprisoned and Bolsonaro being ejected from power. What do you think about the role of Brazil?
Brazil has played a significant role in promoting a negotiated solution. Lula has expressed over and over and again, along with Qatar, along with Colombia, the need to have a negotiated discussion, the settlement between the U.S. and Venezuela. He's opposed U.S. intervention. He has spoken openly about it. But again, he has his own concerns economically to deal with in terms of a potential election in Brazil in the coming year, where he hopes to get reelected. So we've heard that condemnation also from Mexico, also from most of the countries of Latin America, even from Chile, where they have strong differences with Maduro, but they also are strongly opposed to a U.S. intervention. So we hear Brazil, we hear it from other countries, we hear it from Mexico, we hear it from Chile, and we've heard it from other countries in Latin America.
And just a couple of final things. I mean, one of them I just mentioned about Brazil there. The foreign policy advisor to Lula has warned about the potential of a Vietnam in Latin America as a consequence. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that the U.S. is confronting a challenge in Venezuela that it has not seen previously. There are no fissures within the Venezuelan military evident so far. There's an old saying in Venezuela: the military is loyal until it's not. And right now, the military has been loyal, which presents a very significant challenge to the U.S. The U.S. does not have a strong sense of the internal dynamics of that military, because as a result of the coup of 2002, that military radicalized. That military is now closely tied to the political apparatus. It is invested in the political apparatus. It has economic interest in that political apparatus. So in that sense, the U.S. might face a much challenged position vis-a-vis the Venezuelan military, the militias, the different guerrilla groups that are on the border with Colombia. So that the U.S. is looking at a much more complex scenario than it imagined initially. It's kind of reminiscent of what happened in Iraq, right? In the build-up to Iraq, the U.S. was told by Shalaby and by other people that it would be a cakewalk, that they would just walk in, that they would be greeted, that they would be welcomed. We're hearing exactly the same thing. It's a repeat. If we look at the reasons for intervening in Iraq, the reasons for intervening in Venezuela, drugs are now the weapons of mass destruction. The Venezuelan military will fracture. None of that has happened, and none of that was true.
I mean, you're right. I mean, I remember being an undergraduate at Oxford, and we had someone speaking on Chatham House Rules, a senior army officer, let's put it that way, back in 2002, who predicted that 99% of the Iraqi population would be throwing flowers at troops, and the other 1% would stay at home because they were scared to come out, but then would 100% of the population. I never quite worked out the maths there. Didn't work out. Not how it panned out. But I mean, again, we know what happened in Iraq. They did invade, and it was one of it's the great foreign policy catastrophe of our time, unless we include Israel's genocide in Gaza. What do you think? I mean, what if you were to make a prediction about where this is heading? What would your prediction be?
I think the U.S. will continue to ratchet up the pressure. Will continue to try to escalate. I don't think that we're looking at a land invasion. The consequences of that, far-reaching, would be tremendous, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire region of Latin America, would bog down the U.S. On a potentially long-term conflict. I guess I'm not looking at a land invasion. I'm looking at strategic attacks, potentially, further efforts at seizing cargo ships at sea, and efforts politically to isolate Maduro further. I wouldn't discount a strategic strike in Venezuela if the escalation does not prove successful. But I don't see a landed military attack on Venezuela or a long-term military presence.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, and a real tour de force there. Very, very detailed and informative exposition of an unsettling, let's put it that way, very unsettling situation. Miguel, honestly, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating stuff. For those watching, share the video, press like, subscribe, leave your comments, leave your thoughts. Want to hear what you think. Miguel, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.